Hello and welcome to the course Introduction to the Psychology of Language. I am Dr. Ark Verma from IIT Kanpur and this is the second week of the course. In this week we have been talking about various ways in which children acquire language and they acquire different aspects of language. What are the tasks and challenges that children kind of need to undertake in order to acquire language like adults have. In the last three lectures of the week, we have talked about different aspects like phonological perception, categorical perception. We've talked about segmenting in one of the last lectures. Today, we will start talking about some of the other aspects of acquiring language. More importantly, today's lecture will focus on how children acquire word meanings. Now, if you remember, one of the things that children need to do while they are processing this continuous flow of speech is that they need to segment this speech down into shorter segments. These shorter segments are basically words which obviously have some correspondence or meaning in the larger scheme of things. For a child, for example, it is very important once the child has segmented this stream of speech into shorter words. For a child, it is very important the child now makes up what each of these segment corresponds to, what is the meaning of each of these segment. This is precisely what we will be talking about in today's lecture. So, I will begin with a quote that Traxler puts forth, and this quote is from Paul Bloom, who has done a lot of work with respect to children's language acquisition. Now, if you look at this, he says, Paul Bloom says, children start to produce words at about age of 12 months. If we stick to the more conservative estimates of, let us say, a vocabulary of 60,000, this already equates to learning up to 10 new words each day till the end of high school. Now, this quote kind of tells us about the enormity of the task at hand. Children, in the course of their education, or say for example the course of their lives, starting from let us say 16 to 18 months when the child starts speaking its first words, and then there is the vocabulary spurt, and then the child starts speaking in telegraphic speech. Eventually the child speaks full sentences. During this period, which is the early period to the period when the child enters school, obviously studies more complicated subjects, talks in more adult like manner, so to speak, children develop astoundingly large vocabulary as they are growing from children to adults. They are picking up so many things. Now, how many of these words you would think that children are basically learning through explicit instruction, especially in the beginning days? How many of the words, let us say, I think in one of the last lectures I probably mentioned that, or maybe today we can talk about that, one of the first things that a child kind of does or one of the first words that a child picks up is probably through isolated word learning, which probably might have been facilitated through infant directed speech, child directed speech, or the child would have picked that word from a sentence embedded in a particular nursery rhyme, or so on and so forth. Now, how many of these words, first 30-40 words that a child learns, are actually taught through explicit training? That's one of the questions that we can talk about today. Okay, but the bottom line is that for a fact the children are extremely good at learning words, and this is something that they more often do without explicit instruction. They pick up some of these words, they create new words, they come up with all sorts of utterances which they use to describe the world around them. Okay, so they're very good at picking these words quickly. As I was saying earlier, it takes about 18 months for a child to learn his or her first words, and after that they experience a dramatic change in their vocabulary and in their ability to acquire words. Okay, this dramatic change is referred to as the vocabulary spurt or the word spurt, whereafter it is said that children kind of start picking up words at a very rapid pace. Before this it is much slower. All right. So, there are challenges to doing this. I mean, we have been talking about this in some of the earlier lectures as well, but there are challenges into, say for example, how does the child pick up his first words? Maybe through association, maybe say for example, when I said pen and I looked at this object, the child kind of made a mental note in his or her mind, and okay, pen, the sound pen corresponds to this object. Or say for example, when people say to the child, this is your mama or this is your papa, and then the same person appears consistently at saying that particular sound, again and again over a period of time, maybe the child associates that word mama to to his mother, or the word papa to his father or her father, and this is how children are doing it. However, doing this consistently for so many objects is not something that the child will very quickly achieve. Okay, and there are obviously problems that can arise, problems of interpretation, problems of multiple things kind of coming together even when one word is said. And on the basis of this, if you remember in one of the last lectures also, I discussed a little bit about the problem that Noam Chomsky pointed out, and this problem was referred to as the poverty of stimulus problem. So poverty of stimulus problem basically, again as pointed by Chomsky, to kind of counter the argument of the rationalists slash behaviorists that language could be picked up from the environment, what Chomsky said also kind of applies here. The environment does not provide a lot of help to the child with respect to choosing the correct correspondences between sounds and objects, or between sounds that represent words and the objects in the real world. Okay, that is something interesting. So for example, children hear so many different sounds, okay, and say for example a child hears mama, papa, bat, ball, milk, food, so many different things. A lot of times when you are saying food, you probably might be saying food in with respect to milk as well, with respect to, say for example, baby foods, Cerelac, etc. as well, with respect to vegetables as well, with respect to fruits as well, and you're still saying your food is here. And the child has no way of kind of really making a correspondence of the word food with any of these things. But food in that sense is sort of a basic category word. We will talk about this in a little bit more detail as we move further. But food is a basic category word. It does not either stand for apple or oranges or milk or Cerelac or anything for that matter. So I'm just trying to give these examples again and again to make you appreciate that the environment per se can really mislead the child as to interpreting what the meaning of specific words could be like. Okay, moving ahead, some people have proposed that maybe children are kind of making a correspondence between words and meanings by using methods like, say for example, the point and say method. So we do this with children all the time. So look at that, that is a cat. Look at this, this is a chair. Look at this is a pen. And what we are doing is we are pointing our fingers and saying something. So what the child does is the child is making note of what is the object in the world that I am pointing my finger to. So what I am doing is I am drawing the attention of the child to that particular object. Once I am drawing the attention of the child to that particular object and saying a particular word consistently over a period of time, I am probably trying to help the child to make this match between what I am saying and what is the object that I am pointing out. However, this is also something that can run into problems. There is a very interesting example that I think Quine takes up, and Traxler also discusses it in some detail, and this example is about a story, and the story goes like there were two tribal men and there was this tourist. And this tourist was going with these tribal men in a jungle, and suddenly what they see is that is a hare rabbit is just hopping past by them. Okay, so when the rabbit is hopping past by them, one of these tribal guys looks to the other and says "Gavagai." Okay, so this says "Gavagai" and the person kind of, I don't know what they respond, but the idea is that the tourist listens to this, and the tourist who does not speak their language and who's just seen an event happening is trying to make out what does "Gavagai" mean. Now this seems to be a very trivial problem, but let me just complicate it for you. "Gavagai" could mean rabbit, it could mean the rabbit is running, it could mean that rabbit is white in color, it could mean that the rabbit is awesome food, it could mean that rabbit is running very fast, it's going to its house, it's indicating some danger, or what a beautiful rabbit, anything of this. Now this is the problem with this point and say method, or this is the problem with the poverty of stimulus argument. So you can kind of use this example to argue for both of these problems, which kind of are just trying to demonstrate that it is indeed difficult. It's a difficult proposition for a person, a child that we are talking about, or say for example, again as I said, you try and listen to the meaning listen to a movie or a song which is not in your language and you have no idea about that language, and you try and kind of make out the meaning of what the things are. So this is something that tells us that some of these methods that we can sometimes usually assume that are helping children acquire meanings might not be as good after all. Okay. So the point and say thing, the children, the proposition is that the children might be picking up word meaning by the point and say method. It is sort of something that does not really help. I'm sure it helps to an extent. I'm sure it is helpful to an extent, but it is not the complete answer to how children might be picking up word meanings. That's what I want to say. Okay. Also, there is another problem with point and say. Point and say could work for concrete objects. I'm showing you this is pen. I'm showing you, say for example, there's a chair, there's a table, and there's a camera. I can show you so many of these things, and I can say these words. That is one. But say for example, what about abstract nouns? What would happen if I'm talking about I am feeling sad today, or let us say I am feeling happy today? In some of these cases, say for example, you can show the expression on your mouth and you can say that okay, feeling sad looks like this. But in most cases, say for example, I am feeling very excited today. Okay. A lot of times or say for example, how do you talk about kindness or guilt, or say for example, any of those abstract things? How is the child going to achieve those meanings by point and say? How does the child know what is good and bad by point and say? So there are some of these problems here. Also, there is data that says that blind children they learn words about the same rate as seeing children do. Blind children do not really have the advantage of point and say. So how is it that they are also acquiring words at pretty much the same rate? So these are some of the questions that we are posing in front of some of these theories, and we're kind of trying to ask, how is it that the child is learning meaning? Now another problem is also when you see how are the children acquiring word meanings, is how are the children acquiring meanings for particular classes of words. So mostly when you talk about concrete objects and so on, you're talking about nouns. Okay, but what about verbs? How does a child grasp the meaning of a particular verb? And the problem is this. When you use a particular object, suppose I am picking this up and I am saying pen, I am using this particular object, or say for example, I could be using it with my ring or with my watch or anything of like. However, when I am clapping or when I am smiling or when I am speaking, I am not necessarily naming that look at me now I am smiling, or look at me now I am clapping, or look at me now I am speaking. We do not usually name the actions that we are performing, and it is in that sense slightly difficult for the child to pick up what action can be represented by what word. So that is something that child has to make sure of. Also, when you're talking about verbs, say for example, the cat chased the rat. Okay, now cat chased the rat basically is a slightly difficult thing to grasp for a child who's just picking up language, is because the cat chased the rat can also be said as the rat is running from the cat. Okay, or say for example, you can say cat is being chased by the rat, or cat is chasing the rat, anything of that sort. One of the things that kind of makes understanding of verbs slightly more difficult, and we'll discuss that in later section of this lecture also, is this concept of agent versus patient. Who is acting, who is the recipient of that action, what is the object using which action is happening. Suppose say for example, Ram hit Sham with a bat, something like that. Okay, now you have two nouns here, and you have a third noun which is the bat. One is the actor, one is the patient, one is the object of that action, and one is the action. How do you think that the child is kind of going to understand this? Or Pat is being beaten up by Ram, by the bat. Okay, so there are all sorts of utterances that we speak and children come across, and it is in that sense very difficult for the child to grasp any of this. So that's something that is sort of relevant for us to ponder about when we are pondering about how children are acquiring word meanings. Having said that, with these examples, it must be kind of clear that it is not only point and say that works, and it's also not only the environment that can kind of provide enough information for the child to acquire meanings. Okay, so there must be something else that might be happening. So let us look at what are the other proposals on the table? One of the proposals basically from the nativist school of thought is the proposal about genetically guided learning. So there is this hypothesis referred to as the genetically guided learning hypothesis, which says that children are born with innate categories, and these categories are for specific classes of words. So children are born with basic categories of nouns, of verbs, of adjectives and of adverbs, and maybe so on and so forth. And what the child actually needs to do is basically just try and populate each of these categories with their experience. The more they come across objects, they populate the category of nouns. The more they come across actions and things happening in the world, they populate their category of verbs, and then they so on and so forth. Okay. So this is one hypothesis which says that children have an implicit idea innately of what classes of words that might exist, and what they just have to do is they have to just populate those categories, and on the basis of those populating examples reach an understanding of each of these categories. So this is what the genetically guided learning hypothesis says. Steven Pinker is one of the proponent of the hypothesis, and he talks about that in some detail. Another slightly more simplistic alternative to this particular hypothesis has been referred to as the general purpose learning mechanism, or general purpose learning mechanism hypothesis, if you might call it. And the general purpose learning mechanism hypothesis kind of says something very simple, and it says that children kind of do a lot of hit and try, and they kind of pick up particular words, they pick up what the linguistically conveyed information is, and they do it in a sort of a hit and trial kind of a way, and gradually, by using so many words in so many different scenarios, they arrive at, say for example, a mechanism for, okay, this kind of words are nouns, these kind of words are verbs, or say for example this word is used to represent this concrete object, or this word is used to represent this particular action, and then you can kind of involve information about tenses and so on and so forth with this. So there are these two competing hypotheses. As I said in the beginning of this week, that there are two schools of thought here. One of them, the genetically guided learning one, comes from the nativist school, and the other one comes from the more probabilistic learning based school. Okay. So these are the two things. Now according to the latter approach, I will just elaborate on that a little bit. Children remember information better if information is conveyed by use of language. Okay. So going further, it has been proposed that for purposes of word learning, children might start with a slight generic interpretation of the word, and then eventually arrive at a more specific representation by using that word again and again and getting particular feedback. Okay. So that is probably what is happening. Now however, it still seems that children might not be doing either of the things that we said here, neither the genetically guided learning thing nor the general purpose learning thing. They might instead be basically just biased to use certain kinds of basic level labels. So the assumption is they kind of start using words that seem just right to describe objects or events in the environment. These just right levels are referred to as basic level terms, and these basic level terms are different from superordinate level terms and subordinate level terms. I will give you an example. So the word dog or the word cat is just a basic level term. A more subordinate level is what breed of dog or what specific dog it is, and superordinate is like the label animal or mammal. Okay. So basically what children do is they are neither really aware of the animal mammal classification. Say for example, they are not really also aware of the specifics of the breed of the dog as well. What they will do is they will start using dog, and they will kind of eventually figure out, okay, this kind of animal is known as dog, and there are so many kinds of dogs, and later in when they have grown up, they will probably come to the breed part. Okay. So that is typically what is happening. Now this can actually be seen through some of the examples, and some of these examples include what is referred to as extension. So what is extension? It has been seen that children sometimes they could extend a particular kind of word to include all physically similar or sometimes even distantly similar objects in the same label. So this is referred to as overextension. Say for example, you make the child encounter a small furry animal which is very nice to look at, and you say that, okay, this is a bunny. Okay, this is the first animal that the child has probably encountered and probably touched and felt very happy about, And then what happens is next day there's no bunny, but a cat, which is a white cat, furry cat, also comes close to the house, and you're showing the child that look, that is the cat. It might happen that the child kind of says that okay, no, that is a bunny. Or similarly, if the child sees a furry dog or the child sees a soft toy, maybe not really a soft toy, because children kind of appreciate animacy, inanimacy versus living versus non-living things. But anything that looks similar and is an animate object, children might start referring to them by the same name, bunny. This is called overextension. So overextension is basically when children end up applying a known label to a category which adults might probably differentiate between them. Okay, that is overextension. Also, the converse might happen. Sometimes children might fail to generalize. So what they might say, for example, do is that they take a category label, but they apply the category label to a specific instance of that category, but do not apply the category label to other instances of that same category. So there's a very interesting example in Traxler's book, which he says that there was this child and the child used to call his father's vehicle as car. Maybe the father is going out of the office and the child is looking at the father's vehicle through a window, and the mother told, okay, that is father's car. Okay. What happened with this child was that the child failed to generalize car to any other kinds of cars that were available, and he would say car only to his father's car, and every other vehicle, even cars, were referred to as by different names. Okay. So this kind of scenario, when the child fails to generalize stuff, is called underextension. So you see, two kinds of things are possible, and the kind of mistakes that are happening here tell us a little bit that children are probably trying out a lot of things, and they are being corrected with feedback, with more experience, with using them again and again. While they are figuring out how the world works, they reach a place in time where they realize that okay, this is what a word actually means. So this is in some sense a little bit of a summary of how word meanings might happen. Moving on, we can also talk a little bit about some of the strategies that the children must be using in order to finally come in to the main target word, finally arrive at a place that okay, this is what the target word looks like, or this is the exact meaning of this particular target word. So let us look at some of these strategies. One of these strategies is the strategy or the principle of mutual exclusivity. So what does mutual exclusivity say? It says that no two words in the language will have the exact same meaning. Suppose the child hears me say that this is a pen and this is a stylus at the same time. Okay, the child will usually take into account that the same object cannot be represented by two different words. This cannot be a pen and the stylus at the same time. Okay, so this kind of refers to this whole fact that the children will find it slightly difficult to attach one object with two word names. Suppose I am calling this gavagai or I am calling this blicket, or say for example something that the child is seeing is being referred to by two names. What the child reasons is that two words may not usually mean the same thing. Okay, and if they do, the two words might be might be talking about slightly different aspects of this. Say for example, maybe stylus is just this part on the top of the pen, or it's just this nib on the top of the pen, but it's not the entire pen. So basically what the child is doing is, okay, if you're consistently using two words talking about the same object, maybe the two words differ in their application of this concept. So that is one way of looking at it. The other principle that also is kind of complementary to that of mutual exclusivity is the principle of contrast. So this principle of contrast is that the two labels should not apply to the same object, but if they do, the two labels should mean slightly different things. Say for example, the example of the word dog, and if I am saying dog, animal, mammal, all of them should carry different levels of information. So this is also something that the child eventually would learn to figure out. Okay, and eventually the child would know, okay, animal is something different, it is a generic name for all of these living things, and mammal is a particular class of these animals which give birth to offsprings. So in that sense, as opposed to laying eggs, so in that sense the child kind of figures out the exact meaning of some of these words, and some of these strategies might help the child to kind of reach there. Now It has been proposed that children's perceptual systems, so part of how children are understanding words in the world will also be dependent upon how they are looking at the world, how are they creating a representation of the world in their head. So it has been proposed that children's perceptual systems carve the entire world into discrete objects. So usually children deal in objects, they don't deal in things like, okay, these are so many things all muddled up in together. They are kind of looking at, okay, this is a chair, this is a table, this is a pen, this is a camera. So they kind of are looking at the world in with respect to these different discrete concrete objects. And then what happens is that the child kind of goes on to or initiates the learning of words for each of these objects. What is the word that denotes object A? What is the word that denotes object B? What is the word that denotes object C? In this manner. What would happen here is that typically, because object names are nouns, as we all know, children will probably show a tendency of acquiring nouns earlier than acquiring any other class of words. And this is indeed what has been observed in a lot of cross-linguistic studies. People have shown that in general, for the most part, across different languages and across different cultures, infants and toddlers' vocabularies are actually made up by a larger percentage of nouns as compared to words of the other classes. So this is the whole idea here. Now also it has been shown, it has been said that finally children also pay detailed attention to aspects of other people's mental state. Suppose, say for example, I am happy or I am sad, or I am paying attention to this one while I am talking to you, or I am, say for example, so the different mental states that I am going through, children are very responsive and very perceptive to that. Okay, and they kind of try and use that information also while assigning meaning to words. Okay, so that is also something that children are known to be doing. More specifically, what they do is they pay attention to where speakers are focusing their attention when they are speaking something. So if I am talking about this object, or I am looking at this again and again, or I am holding this, I am talking about, okay, this pen has a nib and it has something at the back. A child is, he or she does not have any language at this point, is kind of making these connections. The child is knowing that, okay, this is something that is being talked about and these are so many different words, and they probably refer to different components of this pen. Okay, so this way what the child will be able to do is the child will get a lot of answers to their questions about what words denote what aspects of the world around them. Okay, that is also something that one should remember. Also, it has been seen that children pay attention to speakers' general knowledge and reliability. So they also have a sort of a measure of how reliable a source of information a particular speaker is. So it has been shown, it's been documented in studies that some speakers may have more general knowledge as compared to others. Say for example, children are more likely to believe information that is coming out from an adult's mouth as compared to information that is coming out from their own sibling's mouth, or from their peers who are in the same age group. So children do have a sense of that as well. They will kind of have a general theory of, okay, this person probably knows something more about the world as compared to this person, and so I would probably believe this person a little bit more, and I will try and build my evidence or my theory of the world on the basis of this person's utterances and not of my peer's utterance, who is probably the same age as I am and maybe does not know about the world so much as I do. Okay. So it seems that children do engage, if you look back at this, it seems that children do engage in a sophisticated deduction process, and they weigh multiple factors when they are acquiring this new vocabulary. Okay. This is a little bit about the theories and the strategies of how children are picking up words. We will move to a different section wherein a different kind of hypothesis is there, and this hypothesis says that maybe what children are probably doing is that they are kind of gaining information through syntactic bootstrapping. They are basically gaining information through syntactical cues. What are the syntactical cues? So it said that young children might face more difficulty learning verb meanings than other noun meanings, and so on and so forth. What they probably might be doing is they might be figuring out word meanings and more specifically meanings of particular verbs by looking at the syntactic features of the utterances. Okay, I'll elaborate on this a little bit in more detail. Say for example, while nouns do refer to concrete, directly observable objects, verbs, as I was saying in the earlier section, require the child to understand the speaker's perspective of an event. If I am saying the cat is chasing the dog versus I am saying the dog is being chased by the cat, or the cat is fleeing the dog, there's the example, the duck blickets the rabbit or the rabbit blickets the duck, can actually be different thing. The number of words, the exact identity of words in the two sentences is the same, okay, but the duck blickets the rabbit has a completely different meaning as compared to the rabbit blickets the duck. And the child, if he or she has to figure out what blickets mean, has to really figure out both of the actor and the patient and the perspective with which I am saying this sentence, okay. So this is a little bit problematic. Now you see, and as we have discussed, the point and say method cannot really explain how children might be learning the meaning of words chase or flee or buy this something, the passive voice kind of thing, because the context of the event does not provide enough information. They are just listening to somebody say this sentence and they are probably looking at the event happening in real time. How are they going to make this correspondence? Now one of these hypotheses is referred to as the syntactic bootstrapping hypothesis, which says that syntactic properties of utterances can help children figure out whether a particular word is a noun or a verb and what is that specific action that is denoted by this specific verb. Okay, let us look at this into a little bit more detail. Now syntactic utterances, it has been said, may support meaning inferences in a variety of ways. Okay. For example, when children look at a still picture of someone cutting a cloth and they hear a sentence like this, can you see this person sibbing? Okay. The idea is that when you say sibbing, something that's happening in the end and has a ing sort of continuous sense to it, the child will make sense that okay, sibbing is probably this act of cutting, and they'll make that correspondence. However, if they hear somebody saying, can you see a sib in here, then probably what the child will interpret is sib is probably some object, and then object, there is only one object in the picture, which is the scissor. So the child is going to correspond the name sib with that scissor, and then that is how the correspondence will be established. Eventually, say for example, children also kind of can use syntactic cues to figure out whether nouns in question are countable nouns or they are mass nouns, and so on and so forth. Children also, say for example, pay attention to syntactic characteristics. For example, the sub-categorization frame. What is a sub-categorization frame? For a verb, the sub-categorization frame basically means the number and the kinds of partners that the verb occurs with. So we know that, say for example, in elementary grammar you would have known that, say for example, there are verbs of different kinds. There are transitive verbs, so she slept, and there are intransitive verbs, she slept on a couch. So the verbs can come with objects or without objects. There are a better example could be she cut. She could not have cut without something, or so you would say she cut by the scissor. She pounded the nail using a hammer. So you will see that the kind of partners that the verb is coming with might offer you a clue as to what kind of verb are we talking about. And this is the proposition here, that in the first sentence you can see this example, she blinked versus she blinked her, both are from Traxler. So in the first sentence, blinked will be interpreted as an intransitive verb, versus in the second example the verb blinked will be interpreted as a transitive verb. And there is also some useful information for the child to pick up in order to better understand the meaning of the verb and the kind of the verb that is. Okay. So how are children figuring out these syntactic cues? There is a proposition especially by Fisher and colleagues who have worked in this area for a long time. Fisher says that children develop organized conceptual representation of the viewed event, and when they hear descriptions of the event, they associate the linguistic units with the elements of the non-linguistic units. So this thing is referred to as alignment, and what alignment basically means is that when children are looking at the world around them and they are hearing people's description of the world around them, what they are doing is they are building a conceptual representation of the event as it is taking place, and they align the conceptual representation of the event as is taking place with the linguistic units that they are hearing. And what they do is they try and align the two, they try and match the two things, and on the basis that they try and match the two things, That is how they try and infer the meaning of specific words in that linguistic message. That's precisely what is happening here. So that was all about words. Let's come at some of the conclusions of the take home message. What did we learn today? We learned that children might be using a variety of techniques to make sense of the words they hear. They probably use a sort of a mix of some innate knowledge and some learning mechanisms to kind of home into a particular target and what that particular target word means. And also that they use some helping strategies, say for example either syntactic bootstrapping or mutual exclusivity or principle of contrast, in order to finalize that okay, this is the target word that is in question and this is exactly, or so as to speak, this is very close to the word that this word means. Okay. So that is all for today. We are left with one more lecture wherein we will talk about morphological and syntactic knowledge. Thank you.